This pawn move immediately claims central space, opens diagonals for the queen and bishop, and prepares for rapid development, setting the stage for many common opening systems. This move symmetrically mirrors white's central pawn advance, immediately contesting the d4 square and aiming to develop pieces to active squares, setting the stage for classical open games. Developing the knight to f3 is a standard and excellent move, immediately attacking black's central e5 pawn and preparing for kingside castling. This move, nc6, is a fundamental developing move that defends the e5 pawn and prepares to contest the center, leading to classical defenses like the Ruy-Lopez or Italian game. This move initiates the Ruy-Lopez opening, a classical and strategically rich opening where white immediately pressures black's knight on c6, which defends the e5 pawn, aiming for long-term central control and piece activity. This move initiates the Morphy defense within the Ruy-Lopez, a principled response that questions white's bishop and prepares to either gain a tempo or force the bishop to a less active square. This move continues the Ruy-Lopez opening, where black's pawn on a6 challenges the bishop, forcing it to retreat while maintaining central tension and preventing white's knight from reaching f5. This move, developing the knight and attacking white's central pawn, is a common and active response in the Ruy-Lopez, immediately challenging white's central control and preparing to castle. Castling kingside secures the king and connects the rooks, a standard and prudent maneuver in this Ruy-Lopez opening to prepare for further central action and potential defensive needs. This move develops a piece, prepares for castling, and reinforces the central pawn, all while maintaining flexibility for future play. This move prepares to recapture the pawn on e5 should black decide to capture it with their pawn, while also offering central support and controlling the e-file. Black plays b5, a principled Ruy-Lopez response, challenging white's bishop and gaining queenside space, but it opens the a-file and may weaken the queenside pawn structure later. This repositioning of the bishop back to b3, after white's prior retreat to a4, maintains pressure on the d5 square and prepares for potential central pawn breaks, common in Ruy-Lopez structures. This move solidifies black's pawn structure in the center, preparing to challenge white's control of the d4 square and potentially opening lines for the c8 bishop. This move prepares to reinforce the d4 square and potentially launch a central pawn advance later in the game, solidifying white's positional setup in the Ruy-Lopez. Black completes kingside development by castling, a standard and safe move that prepares to bring the rook into play and secures the king behind a pawn shield, typical in Ruy-Lopez structures. This move is a prophylactic measure, preventing black from playing bg4 and disrupting white's piece coordination. This move, preparing to challenge white's central pawn with d5, aims to open lines for black's pieces and potentially activate the rook on the e-file. This move initiates a central pawn break, aiming to open lines for white's pieces and challenge black's solid pawn structure in the Ruy-Lopez. Morphy defense. Classical variation. This move develops the bishop to a more active diagonal, preparing to contest the center and potentially put pressure on white's queenside pawn structure if white advances the c-pawn. This move initiates the development of the queen's knight towards a more active central square, preparing to support the eventual d4-d5 pawn break and potentially reroute to f1 or g3 for further kingside action. The bishop retreats to the passive f8 square, abandoning the active diagonal after white's central pawn push, potentially hindering black's queenside counterplay and hindering development. This move aims to prevent black from gaining further space on the queenside with b4, while also preparing to potentially advance the queenside pawns itself or support a future c4 break. This move is a prophylactic measure to prevent white's knight from developing to g5, a common outpost in this Ruy-Lopez structure, and also creates a vital pawn escape square on h7 for the king if needed. This repositioning of the bishop to c2 prepares to support the advance of the d-pawn and potentially pressure the e5 pawn through the diagonal. The knight's retreat to b8 signals a potential strategic repositioning, aiming to eventually redeploy via c6 or d7 to a more active square, possibly challenging white's central control or supporting a queenside expansion. This move aims to gain queenside space and potentially restrict black's bishop on b7, while also preparing for a potential queenside pawn advance. The knight repositions to d7 to support potential c5 breaks and to allow the bishop to retreat from the now less threatening diagonal after white's b4 pawn push. This move repositions the bishop to a more active diagonal, supporting the central pawn push and potentially preparing for a queenside expansion or a tactical strike. This move aggressively challenges white's queenside pawn structure, aiming to open lines for black's pieces and disrupt white's spatial advantage gained from the previous pawn advances. This move repositions the bishop to a more active diagonal, supporting potential pawn advances and preparing to contest the center more effectively. This move prepares to expand on the queenside with circa 5, challenging white's central control and opening lines for black's pieces. This move initiates white's central pawn push strategy, aiming to open lines for white's pieces and gain central space by reinforcing the d4 pawn. This pawn capture, axb4, challenges white's queenside pawn structure and aims to open the a file for black's rook, potentially creating attacking chances and disrupting white's spatial advantage. This capture opens the c-file for white's rook, creating potential attacking lines and contesting central space, while black must decide if recapturing immediately is best or if it's preferable to maintain the pawn structure elsewhere. The exchange on d4 opens the e-file for white's rook and challenges black's central pawn majority, requiring careful follow-up to exploit the resulting pawn structure. This move, nfx d4, recaptures the pawn and repositions the knight to a more active central square, potentially supporting a future d5 pawn push and challenging white's central control. This move challenges white's central pawn structure and opens lines for black's pieces, aiming to exploit the slightly awkward placement of white's knight on d4. This pawn exchange opens the b-file for white's rook, potentially creating attacking opportunities along the semi-open file while liberating white's knight to move towards the center or to squares like c5. This capture opens the d-file and centralizes the pawn, creating dynamic tension and opportunities for tactical play while challenging white's central control. This knight sacrifice exploits the weakened light squares on black's kingside and creates immediate threats against black's queen and king. This move, nxe4, is a critical tactical response to white's recapture, aiming to disrupt white's central control and potentially win material by exploiting the undefended pawn on e4. This move develops the queen to a more active central square, eyeing the weak c5 pawn and supporting the knight on b3, while also preparing to potentially double rooks on the c-file if the opportunity arises. The knight retreats to f6 to regroup, avoiding the immediate threat of the queen and bishop battery, while also preparing to challenge the center and potentially support a future c4 advance. This move, nc3, initiates a recapture of the pawn on circa 5, bringing development and central influence back into play for white while preparing to contest the d-file. This move, ing5, aggressively repositions the knight to a powerful outpost, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and create threats against the f3 knight and potentially the kingside. This move develops the bishop to an active diagonal and prepares for potential pawn breaks on the kingside or central counterplay with the d4 pawn. This exchange of rooks is necessary to relieve the pressure on the e-file and simplify the position, as black's rook on e8 was defensively strained. The recapture on e1 is essential to remove black's active rook and prevent any immediate counterplay on the open e-file, while also consolidating white's central control and preparing to redeploy the rook to a more advantageous square. This move develops the queen to a more active square, eyeing the d4 pawn and potentially supporting further kingside action while connecting the rooks. This move aims to redeploy the bishop to a more active diagonal, targeting black's queenside pawns and supporting a potential advance of the d-pawn. The queen repositions to c6 to exert pressure on the d4 pawn and potentially support a future c4 pawn push to gain central space. This move repositions the rook to the third rank, supporting the advance of the g-pawn and potentially contesting the c-file, while also preparing to connect the rooks and enhance the king's safety. This move repositions the bishop to a more active square on the long diagonal, preparing to defend the pawn on c5 and potentially attack the white queen. This move aims to drive away black's knight from the key g5 square, preventing potential mating threats and creating new attacking possibilities for white's pieces, particularly on the kingside. This move repositions the knight to a more active square on the kingside, potentially supporting kingside pawn advances or preparing for a central thrust with the g-pawn. This move prepares to reroute the knight to a more active square, likely c4 or e3, to contest the open d-file and pressure black's central pawn structure. This move is a tactical gambit, sacrificing a knight for a potential pawn break with nh2 and to open lines for your queen and bishop against white's king. This move initiates a decisive tactic to simplify the position and exploit black's king safety by exchanging pieces, ultimately aiming to win material. This brilliant sacrifice exploits white's exposed king, forcing it to move and allowing black to regain material or create further threats with the open diagonals. This move is a necessary king safety maneuver, repositioning the king to avoid the discovered attack threat from the bishop on h2, thereby preventing tactical complications. This move regains a pawn, but the exposed black king after the sequence of exchanges, combined with the open lines towards it, creates a dangerous tactical situation where white's pieces are well coordinated for an attack. This move initiates a defensive counterattack, aiming to disrupt black's well-placed bishop on h2 and potentially regain material by exploiting the exposed black king and the weak f3 pawn. This move initiates a crucial defensive maneuver, aiming to reposition the queen to a safer square and protect the king after white's aggressive pawn push, preparing for potential counterplay.